Hello, I am pleased to welcome you to the Global Perspectives on Health and Social Relations. My name is Toni Antonucci. I'm the Duvon Collegiate Professor at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Our first presenter is Dr. Jess Francis. She will present a paper on digital technology use and psychosocial health among older adults during the COVID-19 pandemic. Dr. Francis is a researcher at the Institute for Social Research at the University of Michigan. Her work focuses on issues related to technology use, aging, and health among marginalized populations. Dr. Francis.
Hi there, my name is Jess Francis, and I will be presenting today my presentation on digital technology use and psychosocial health among older adults during the COVID-19 pandemic. I'll be presenting on behalf of my co-author, Dr. Christine Ajrouche, professor of sociology at Eastern Michigan University and adjunct research professor at the Institute for Social Research at the University of Michigan. So let's get started. So it's currently estimated that as many as 10 million adults aged 50 and older experience depressive symptoms. Since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, 19% of older adults in the US reported worsening depression. During the pandemic, older adults also reported increased anxiety, reduced sleep, and struggle to adapt to technology use for telemedicine and social connection. And this is of specific interest to us because our research is based in the convoy model of social relations. Now, social networks have been conceptualized as convoys comprised of various social ties of differing emotional closeness that evolve over time. These ties provide us with social support throughout our life and impact our overall well-being. Information communication technology use, or ICT use, can facilitate older adults' connection to their social network ties and support and mitigate threat of depressive symptoms and improve overall well-being. Now, during the pandemic, 4 out of 5 older adults relied on ICTs to communicate with others, and this is a marked increase from previous years. 15% of older adults, however, reported that they don't have access to any type of internet, while 60% of older adults cite that the cost of the internet is a problem. And this is from a national report conducted by AARP in 2021. So this leads us to our research question for this study. Given that during the pandemic, we were all limited to how we could interact with our important others, and many of us had to rely solely on ICTs to connect with any source of support or information or connection to the outside world. We're especially curious about how does ICT communication with our social network ties affect depressive symptoms among older adults during the COVID-19 pandemic. So this brings us to our study. So our data came from an NIA administrative supplement to expand the Alzheimer's disease risk and ethnic factors, the case of Arab Americans, R01 grant through the NIA. Our study was a phone survey of older adults aged 65 and older. We focused on social relations, experiences during the COVID-19 pandemic, and cognitive health. Our sample was a probability sample of Middle Eastern, Northern African, or MENA, Black and white residents of the Detroit metro area in the United States. To assess our question, our measures included a dependent variable, depressive symptoms, which was measured out of 10 items from the CESD, scored on a scale of 1 to 4, and then summed. Our independent variables were social network size. We asked people to list up to 10 people that they talk to on a regular basis, including friends and family. And average frequency of ICT communication. For this measure, we averaged the frequency by which older adults communicated with others by phone, text, which would include email and social media, and video chat. And these were scored on a scale of 1 to 4, from irregularly to every day. We also looked at a series of demographic variables and self-rated health. Which brings us to our sample findings. So for our sample, our participants had an average depressive symptoms score of 17.5, which puts our sample just over the threshold for being at risk to develop depression. The cutoff point being a score of 16. We had roughly 32% MENA participants, 34% Black participants, and 34% white participants, non-MENA participants. Our sample was 58% female, and the average age of our participants was about 72.5 years old. The network size on a score of 1 to 10 for the average participant was about a 4.8, or just under 5 people. Average frequency of contact on a scale 1 to 5 for face-to-face contact, so without using any form of ICT, was about a 2.3. And then for ICT communication, the score was about just over that at 2.7. And the N for this particular sample was 424 participants. So in order to address our research question, we performed a series of regression models, and for ease of reading on the screen, I've gone ahead and I've circled our significant associations here. As you'll see, with depressive symptoms as our dependent variable, we see that household income has a consistent, significant and negative association with depressive symptoms throughout the 5 models. Self-rated health, likewise, has consistently shows up as significant and negative in relation to depressive symptoms. And average tech use comes in as significant and negative with depressive symptoms. Now, what's interesting here as well is we see no significant differences between the racial groups, no significant relationship with network size or frequency of face-to-face contact. So we'll move forward here and we'll kind of discuss what this means. So what we're seeing is that the average frequency of ICT communication among our older adult sample had a significant and negative association with depressive symptoms, regardless of network size, frequency of face-to-face contact, and in addition to higher rated health. This is particularly of interest because as older adults typically have smaller networks when compared to younger generations, this helps demonstrate the possible importance of ICT access, education, and use for older adults in order to maintain well-being. And this, I would argue, is not just during a pandemic, but all the time as our world becomes more connected, more technologically advanced. ICT access for older adults in particular will be of increasing importance. And third, income is a factor. And this is prevalent throughout the digital divide literature. When it comes to technology access and use, and when we ask the question, who benefits most, it stands the test of multiple studies that the rich will get richer, meaning those with higher incomes will see the benefit of ICT use, especially when it comes to well-being. So again, when we're thinking of, those in our community who are digitally divided, who don't have access to ICTs, we do need to focus on individuals of lower incomes, no matter, again, regardless of racial group, education, and network size. So I'd like to address some areas that we can do better and that we can move into now that we have this basis of research. So one of our limitations with this study was that it's a cross-sectional sample. So although we're seeing some associations here, we can't really draw any conclusions at this point. Moving forward, a longitudinal analysis would help to greatly illuminate the relationships that are existing within these variables or among these variables. The second limitation, if you will, is that this is a crisis sample. We're collecting this data during one of the more stressful times in global history, in the midst of a pandemic, with a lot of uncertainty, where older adults in particular were at risk. So these relationships, these variables will be interesting to see how they relate to one another following the pandemic era, and if any of these trends hold true beyond this moment in time. Moving forward, it'll also be interesting to look at these associations among other generations, younger generations in particular, because we know that there are significant differences related to well-being and technology use when you compare younger to older generations. And finally, it'll be interesting moving forward to look at different types of ICT use. Right now, we're looking at frequency. Moving forward, it would be interesting to see how people are using these ICTs, and specifically which modalities present the greatest benefit. So what does this mean? In an aging world where we're going to see the number of older adults on the planet explode by the year 2050, keeping in mind that so many older adults in particular, regardless of where they live in the world, are digitally divided, will be of increasing importance for the reason that we see here, that when we use ICTs to connect with one another, there is a benefit to our overall well-being. ICTs are an important facilitator of our connection to our social networks and to our social support. In a quote from Alison Bryant, the Senior Vice President of Research at AARP, she says, "Technology enabled older adults to better weather the isolation of the pandemic, from ordering groceries to telehealth visits to connecting with loved ones. But it also exacerbated the divide. So much more is done online, and the 38 million disconnected older adults in the United States alone are being further left out." This should spur us on to do more ICT research, to communicate with policymakers and other representatives of our society and our communities to ensure that we can provide the best access and opportunity for ICT use and education for older adults, in order to give everyone an equitable chance at maintaining their well-being, no matter whether we're in a pandemic or in much calmer times. The benefit of ICT use should be sought out for all generations. That's my presentation. I want to thank you all for listening. I want to thank my co-author, Dr. Christina Zruch, and my team at the LCD, Life Course Development Program at the ISR at the University of Michigan. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me at jessfran@umich.edu. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Jess. Those were very important points you were making. We turn next to Dr. Rita Hu, who is a graduate student, a doctoral candidate in social work and developmental psychology at the University of Michigan. She will be presenting her study titled Migration History's Effects on Social Isolation and Loneliness.
My name is Rita Xiaochen Hu. I am a doctoral candidate in the social work and psychology at University of Michigan. Before we start, I would like to thank the chair of the symposium, Dr. Tony Antonucci, for this opportunity to share my work. I also would like to acknowledge the Elizabeth Duvan Junior Scholars Fund for supporting me to share my work at this international conference. The study I'm presenting today is titled Migration History: The Effect on Social Isolation and Loneliness. The theoretical framework that inspired this study is the convoy model of social relations. Social relationships are multidimensional and longitudinal. They are influenced by personal and situational factors. They also emerge, change, and sustain over time and across places. We will use the convoy model to take a closer look at the migration history and social isolation and loneliness. Social isolation and loneliness are long-lasting issues faced by older adults and are highly prevalent. They're significantly correlated, but should be distinguished. As suggested by the convoy model, social isolation is more objective about the structure of the social convoy. It is the lack of social contact and involvement. Loneliness is more subjective and about relationship quality within the convoy. It is feeling of a shortfall of one's social relationship. Both social isolation and loneliness have serious and long-lasting effect on physical and mental health, quality of life, cognitive functions, and mortality. Moreover, social demographic characteristics, as well as physical, functional, mental, and cognitive health have all been identified as risk factors associated with social isolation and loneliness. Now let's shift our attention to the left side of the convoy model. Personal and situational characteristics play a critical role in shaping the development of our social convoy. Therefore, the experience of migration and the timing of migration may play a role in developing and/or preventing social isolation and loneliness. Destination countries' language and cultural differences may make making new relationship harder. The physical distance from home country and the change in living situations can lead to changes in network members and support systems. Studies suggest that migrants who are younger in age appear to adapt more quickly than older migrants. From a developmental science perspective, age can play a critical role in the development of social relationships. Therefore, it is critical to take the age of migration into account. The lifetime perspective also reminds us that the life history of migration early in life can be related to health and well-being later in life. Therefore, our present study asks 3 research questions. Does the migration history early in life affect people's social isolation and loneliness later in life separately? And second question, does multiple migration history earlier in life affect people's social isolation and loneliness later in life? And third, does the age of immigration to the US affect people's social isolation and loneliness later in life? The samples draw from the Health and Retirement Study, HRS, which has a nationally representative sample of older adults aged 50 and older living in the US. Since 2017, led by Dr. Jackie Smith, the HRS started to collect a life history of their participants. In this mail survey, participants were asked about their education, immigration, residential, health, and even caregiving histories before the age of 50. The measure of migration history come from the Life History Mail Survey. And since 2006, the HRS collects information about participants' social isolation and sense of loneliness through their psychosocial questionnaire. They survey half of the entire panel in each wave. So for the current study, we used response collected in 2016 and 2018 to have the full panel. The independent variables are constructed based on a series of questions about migration history. The respondent will ask, did you live outside of the US for 6 months or more before 4 different age periods? Respondent can choose yes or no. Based on US immigration regulation, living in the United States for at least 6 months can be considered permanent residence. We constructed a dichotomized yes-no variable on migration history by assigning yes to people who answered yes at least one of those age periods, and no to people who reported no experience living outside of the US. We calculated the number of migration period and episode by summing the number of migration experience they indicated across different age periods. We also calculate the age of immigration to the US, which I will explain more in the next slide. The age of immigration to the US has 4 categories. So for example, people who immigrated after age 10, in the question, they probably indicated no to live in the US before age 10. However, they must have indicated yes all the way from age 10 to age 50. And on the other end, so if we look at people who categorize as immigrated after age 26 to 50, then they probably indicated no for whether they live in the US or not, all the way until age 25, and then indicated yes to the last age period. The dependent variable included social isolation and loneliness. Social isolation is measured based on network size, frequency of contact with adult children, family and friends, attending religious service, and engage with social activities. The higher the score, the more isolated the person seems to be. And loneliness is measured by UCLA loneliness scale, including items such as I felt left out. And we average across 11 items. So the higher the score, the more lonely a person feels. Based on previous literature, we identified demographics and health variables that can be related to social isolation and loneliness. We controlled those in our analysis. And since the migration history asked until age 50, we made sure that the sample included in the study were at least 50 years old when they responded to the question about social isolation and loneliness. That's why the age range is 50 to 100 there. I also want to highlight that 19% of the entire sample of 8,172 have lived outside of the US for more than 6 months. So results from linear regression shows that, so for research 1, whether people have migration experience earlier in life is not really associated with social isolation or loneliness later in life. So this is a dichotomized variable for people who at least have indicated one migration experience across all 4 age periods. And for research question 2, actually people with 2 migration episodes are more likely to be more socially isolated later in life, particularly after age 50, compared to people who have no migration experience. So these migration episodes can be continuous, such as lived outside of the US all the way until age 17, or it can be in different life periods, such as lived outside of the US before 10, moved to the US, then maybe left between age 29 to 50. And then for research question 3, compare with people with no immigration experiences, people who migrated to the US after age 10 and after age 10 to 17 are more likely to be socially isolated after age 50. So to our knowledge, this is one of the first studies to look at migration history's effect on social isolation and loneliness later in life. Our findings contradicts The findings about people immigrated younger in age may adapt better. People who immigrated around teenage years may experience more identity confusion or missed a core developmental period for social relationship. I myself immigrated to the US when I was 15 without my parents. And I have to admit that unlike many of my classmates who have hometown friends since they were born there, I don't have a hometown in the United States, which I have. However, this country ended up, however, I have already spent half of my life living here. Well, on the other hand, back in my hometown, I have a hometown, but I don't have many friends there because I haven't been living there for a long time. And so I think this might review a potential social relationship dilemma that happens if people migrate during a specific period of time. And then the possible explanations for people who immigrated older might be less socially isolated, can be that older migrants may have a stable and close court network, such as their families in the US. And on the other hand, younger immigrants may become distant from their family members due to just long distance and time away from home. And moreover, the findings confirm that social isolation and loneliness need to be distinguished and examined separately, because so far with our results, all the significant effects happened only on social isolation, so the objective structure, not so much on loneliness. In the light of our globalizing world and refugee crises, we should really pay more attention to the migration experiences across the lifespan by further understand the lived experience of migrants through both quantitative and qualitative studies. And that concludes my presentation. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to email me at rxhu@umich.edu. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Rita. We turn next to Dr. Catherine Fiore. She is professor and chair of the undergraduate psychology at the Derner School of Psychology at Adelphi University in Garden City, New York. She will be presenting her paper on the increasing importance of friendship in late life, understanding the role of socio-historical context in social development.
Today, I'm going to be talking about the increasing importance of friendship in late life and understanding the role of socio-historical context in social development. I'd just like to briefly acknowledge my co-authors, Dr. Tim Windsor and Dr. Oliver Huxhold. So friendships may be particularly important for the well-being of older adults, as these relationships offer interactions with same-age peers that tend to be primarily positive and may boost feelings of autonomy. But empirical work shows that adults tend to focus less on friends and more on family as they age, partially due to life events and the loss of age peers through mortality, but also for more deliberate reasons like preferring to spend time with their most familiar social partners. However, recent studies indicate that the maintenance of strong bonds with friends may be increasing in importance among adults generally, and especially among older adults. For example, later born cohorts of older adults have larger networks with a greater proportion of friends than earlier born cohorts. These historical changes in the importance of friendships may be due in part to evolving age and gender norms that scholars believe have led to increased flexibility and greater diversity in relationships. Several lifespan theories provide insights into the nature of social development, including socio-emotional selectivity theory, which highlights the role of friendships for socio-emotional functioning in later life. The convoy model addresses the general structure of social networks, but also highlights how age-related changes in individuals' social network composition are driven by both personal characteristics and changes in context. So for example, retirement can profoundly change the nature of individual social networks. More recently, Bleasner and colleagues drew on the convoy model and other fundamental social network theories to posit an integrative conceptual framework for late life friendship. This model highlights how interacting individual and social structural positions shape friendship-related cognitions, feelings, and behaviors. So guided by a new conceptual framework known as the differential investment of resources, or DIRE model, developed by myself and my colleagues, that builds off of these earlier theories and models. Today, we're going to present the specific mechanisms through which we believe changes in socio-historical context may be driving the increasing diversity of social ties in older adulthood that we see today. So this is a picture of the model. And first, what I'd like to do is just to describe the relevant key pieces of this model for today's presentation. The DIRE model has 6 distinct features that I'm going to explain. First, the model distinguishes between different types of social ties by defining 2 crucial dimensions: closeness, which is an individual's evaluation of how central a specific tie is to their day-to-day quality of emotional experience, and kinship, which is a mental construct encapsulating the expectation that a specific tie will provide support in times of need, stemming from primarily genetic relatedness and societally institutionalized processes and norms, but also increasingly mutual discourse. Second, the investment of time and energy is defined as the core mechanism that explains the formation and maintenance of social ties. So an individual's resources are limited, and they're defined as available time and energy in our model. And the investment is essentially the amount of time and energy devoted to creating and or maintaining social ties. Energy here representing the perceived potential to perform a task. So that is the key mechanism that describes the social ties. Third, individual characteristics determine the amount of resources available, or capacities, the direction of the investment, or motivations, and the efficacy of the time and energy invested into social ties, otherwise known as skills. So capacities are individual characteristics that affect the amount of time and energy that a person has available to invest into social ties. These are things like health, cognitive abilities, and emotional functioning. Whereas motivations are individual characteristics that define the direction and extent of the investment of time and energy. So they determine in which social interactions an individual decides to invest, whether it's investing in friends or in family. These are things like personality traits, future time perspectives, and perceptions of aging. Finally, skills are individual characteristics that influence the efficacy of investments into social interactions. So how good we are at interactions. These are things like theory of mind. Fourth, and key to this presentation, is that the model incorporates context in 3 ways in its effects on, first, the social opportunity structure, second, time and energy, and third, the individual. So we view the context here as all of the factors that are relevant for understanding the formation of social networks. Consistent with adaptations of Bronfenbrenner's view, we acknowledge that context can be organized on multiple levels. The micro-level context is equivalent to the social network, which is the sum of all social ties. That's what's labeled social ties in this figure. The meso-level context is the contextual entity that links the macro to the micro level. It can be understood as the individual's living situation, for example, geographical factors, socioeconomic conditions, and life course phases. All macro level effects operate through this living situation, and hence you see the circles are overlapping for the meso and macro level contexts in this figure. The macro level context includes the social structure of the society. So for example, social and political institutions, laws, and distribution of wealth, as well as the societal and cultural norms. And again, we believe that contextual factors operate via 3 primary pathways in influencing individual social networks. First, and perhaps most importantly, is in their effect on the social opportunity structure, which represents all of the potential ties in which an individual can invest, so the availability of ties, as well as the costs of investment in terms of time and energy into those ties. Second, the context can have a direct effect on time and energy, conceptualized as constraints. And finally, context can operate in its effect on the individual via capacities, motivations, and skills. The 5th key piece of the model is that the investment in social ties can provide individuals with the means to influence their opportunity structure and their contextual conditions. This is what's sometimes known as social capital. All of those resources embedded in the social network that influence the individual's opportunity structure and or their living situation. This could be conceptualized also as bridging potential. And we're not going to be focusing on that today. And the last point of the model, which is also not a focus of today's presentation, but just to fully describe the model, The model describes how different types of ties in turn affect individual characteristics via social functions. And those three social functions are social exchanges, social influences, and social evaluations. But again, the focus of today's presentation is really to understand the mechanisms through which context can explain the increasing importance of friendship in the lives of older adults. And like I said, there are three potential pathways. So let's start with the role of context in changing the social opportunity structure. Many of the historical changes in the social opportunity structure are consequences of changes in the demographic composition of the population. So for example, because friends tend to be age peers, the large historical gains in life expectancy means that older adults can maintain existing friendships for longer periods and may provide older adults with more opportunities to interact with age peers and make new friends. So in other words, these changes increase the availability of ties in which older adults can invest time and energy. In contrast, decreasing fertility rates and increasing childlessness will likely translate to a reduced availability of children for future older adults, such that more recent cohorts of adults may invest more resources into non-kin ties who can provide support traditionally provided by legally defined kin. Another example is geographical mobility. This can also change the social opportunity structure for older adults. For example, greater mobility could translate into increases in the number of potential ties, in other words, availability of non-kin in particular. But at the same time, such mobility could pose potential threats to longstanding ties. If, for example, adult children and/or close friends of older adults are moving away, in other words, decreasing the availability and potentially increasing the costs of investment into these ties. At the same time, the products of advances in certain kinds of technology, for example, social media and video chatting, not only facilitate staying in touch with geographically distant family and friends, decreasing the costs of investment, but also enable new forms of relationships and relational maintenance, potentially increasing availability and decreasing costs simultaneously. The next pathway I'd like to touch on involves the context working directly on the amount of time and energy available to individuals for investment into the formation and maintenance of social ties, including friendships. So in later life, the transition to retirement represents one such fundamental contextual change. In broad terms, retirement may result in increased discretionary time and energy for investment into valued relationships outside of work prescribed roles. Furthermore, historical changes in work culture may have actually reduced the cost of maintaining work-related relationships after retirement, translating to more of these types of friendships post-retirement. Finally, we turn to the third potential pathway or mechanism, which is the ways in which context can influence the individual. Today, I'm only going to focus on motivations, which likely play a much larger role than capacities and skills in terms of how the context affects individuals from a historical perspective. It should also be noted that historical changes influencing individuals' motivations are also simultaneously changing the social opportunity structure, since the motivations of individuals' ties are also changing. So that's why the social opportunity structure here is highlighted in red, in addition to the pathway going from context to motivations. So for example, historical shifts away from traditional values and towards individualization translates to an increase in the role of personal choice in constructing social networks and a decrease in the emphasis on kin, essentially changing individuals' motivations and decreasing the costs of investing in non-kin. Gender norms are also evolving, which may be associated with decreases in norms against opposite-sex friendships, changing individuals' motivations to invest in opposite-sex ties, as well as reducing the costs of investing in these ties for friendship. We can also think about how socio-historical context has changed individuals' motivations in late life in particular. So historical increases in life expectancy mean that the public has become more aware that older adults have more time left to live. So the pruning of peripheral ties theorized to occur in line with changes in future time perspective may be increasingly delayed in later born cohorts. That is, individuals who are aware of the increased life expectancy and expect to benefit from it may retain an expansive future time perspective until well after retirement age, and thereby be more likely to invest time and energy into friendships until later in life. And evolving age norms emphasize the increasing potential for older adults to be active and socially engaged, which may have translated to positive changes in how individuals perceive their own aging. And in fact, there have been historical increases in positive perceptions of aging. These changes may have shifted the motivations of older adults to invest in friendship ties. And in fact, research shows that older adults with more positive perceptions of aging are more likely to form new friendships 2 years later. So what this presentation has hopefully made clear is that a comprehensive understanding of social development in adulthood needs to be grounded in appreciation of the dynamic interactions between individuals and the contexts in which they are aging. More generally, the influence of genetic relatedness appears to be decreasing in importance, whereas the role of choice seems to be historically increasing in its influence. Of course, ontogenetic changes also play a central role in shaping social behavior. So for example, changing developmental contexts like caring for children in midlife can drastically alter the social opportunity structure. But that was not the focus of this presentation, but it is something that the Dyer model can speak to. So I'd like to thank you for your time and finish there.
Thank you, Kate. Our final speaker is Dr. Christine Ajrouche from the Eastern Michigan University. She's a professor of sociology there, and she's also an adjunct professor in the Life Course Development Program at the University of Michigan. She will be presenting her work on COVID-19 stress and cognitive function in an ethnically diverse sample.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I am delighted to be here, and I'd first like to thank Dr. Tony Antonucci for inviting me to be part of this panel. So I want to start out by defining who are Arab Americans. Those who are living in the United States from the Middle East or those who have Arab ancestry are often invisible in research that aims to advance understanding of health disparities. So I want to start by defining Arab Americans. The definition I use for my research is that it refers to anyone with ancestry to an Arabic-speaking country. It's language-based and therefore a pan-ethnic categorization that includes people who come from 22 different countries with various religions, including both Muslims and Christians, as well as an array of ethnicities that have long lived in Arabic-speaking countries such as Chaldeans and Assyrians. So this term encompasses individuals who trace their ancestries to a diverse number of national origins, ethnic groups, and religious affiliations. Southeast Michigan in the United States is home to the largest, most visible concentration of Arab Americans in the country. According to our US Census data, in 1990, Arab Americans made up less than 1% of the US population. Less than 1% of the population in Michigan. But over the last 30 years, their numbers have tripled, and they now represent 3% of the population in Michigan. The US government, through the Office of Management and Budget, legally classifies Arab Americans as simply white. There is growing evidence, however, to suggest that Arab American experiences do not mirror overall white experiences. For example, socioeconomic status profiles show a bifurcated population where we have large proportions of the Arab American population who have higher than average education level and income than the general population, but at the same time, higher proportions in the lower strata of the socioeconomic strata in the United States, with higher numbers than whites who have very low education levels and who are poverty stricken. Furthermore, accumulating research shows that Arab Americans have higher prevalence of chronic conditions, including diabetes and cardiovascular disease, as well as higher levels of depressive symptoms. Now, in an attempt to make Arab Americans visible during the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, we leveraged an existing study on older adults that was about to go into the field when COVID hit to investigate stress and strain from COVID and its effect on cognitive health. Though it's clear that COVID-19 affects everyone, it became increasingly evident that the racial and ethnic minority experience of COVID was much different than whites, as they were much more likely to have COVID or to have died from COVID. So though the prevalence and incidence of COVID-19 was higher among racial and ethnic minorities, rates of stress are unknown. Stress from COVID could include both economic and social dimensions and may have effects on cognitive health, with stress exposure identified as a key factor in racial and ethnic disparities. Therefore, there are a lot of benefits to having a comparative perspective and making visible in this comparison the group that we know as Arab Americans. So our study goals then were to characterize the prevalence of COVID-19 stress and its effect on cognitive health among 3 racial and ethnic groups in the Metro Detroit area. Our first hypothesis is that Arab Americans will be more likely to report COVID-19 stress than whites, but not more likely than Blacks. Our second hypothesis is that Arab Americans will have worse cognitive health than whites, but not different from Blacks. And our third set of hypotheses are a set of competing questions, with the first hypothesis suggesting that Arab Americans will have worse cognitive health due to COVID-19 stress than whites, but not worse than Blacks. But then the competing hypothesis is that Arab Americans will have better cognitive health due to COVID-19 stress than whites, but not better than Blacks, suggesting that there may be some resilience that has been accumulated over the years due to their situation as a racial and ethnic minority. So our data come from the Detroit Area Wellness Network, which we call DAWN. It was a supplement to a larger study that was halted because of COVID. We couldn't go into the field because it involved face-to-face data collection. Instead, the DAWN study collected data through a 30-minute telephone interview. We ultimately collected data from 606 individuals who were 65 years and older. It was a random probability sample from the 3 counties in Metro Detroit, including Wayne, Oakland, and Macomb. And we also included individuals from the panel sample of the longitudinal social relations study, which has been collecting data on individuals since 1992. So our measures for COVID-19 stress included whether or not individuals had experienced COVID-19 symptoms, whether they had known someone who died from COVID, whether they had experienced a loss of income during the pandemic, and whether or not family conflict had increased during the pandemic. Our cognitive health measures included the CRAD, immediate and delayed recall, category fluency, and digit span forwards and backwards. Our demographic measures included ethnicity and language, with Middle Eastern, Arab American, Arabic speakers being the reference group. Our age was continuous. Our gender variable was male-female, with male being the reference group. And of course, we also had an education measure. So just to give you a snapshot of our sample, the average age of our sample ranged from the early to mid 70s. But I'd like to draw your attention to patterns by ethnicity concerning gender and education. You can see from this graph that the Middle Eastern Arab American sample had a lower percentage of females, only 36% of our respondents were female, than the other 2 groups. Whoops, let me go back. And furthermore, they reported on average lower education levels. Approximately 1/3 of the Arab Americans in our sample completed the survey in Arabic. After adjusting for covariates of age and gender, our results showed that Arab Americans are more likely to report COVID-19 stress than both whites and Blacks. And when we compare to whites in particular, you can see it for all 3 dimensions of, we can see for all 3 dimensions of COVID-19 stress, Arab Americans reported greater prevalence. When we compare to Blacks, it's only with regards to the experience of COVID symptoms. There were no racial or ethnic differences with regards to family conflict. We ran regression models to provide an initial look at each of the cognitive health variables. And here, what I'd like to point your attention to is that Arab Americans tended to report worse performance on category fluency and on the CRAD, immediate and delayed recall. But we ended up actually carrying out structural equation modeling to investigate whether or not Arab Americans have worse cognitive health than whites. And the reason why we did that is because our initial analyses suggest that the performance or the scores on our cognitive measures are indicating more than cognitive ability. In other words, there's a cultural dimension here. So this first model compares the racial and ethnic groups without controlling for any demographics. And what we see here is that whites have better cognitive function than Arab American English speakers, who are a reference group, but the Arab American English speakers have better cognitive health than the Arabic speakers. Now, what I want to point out here is that once we controlled for age, gender, and education, the racial and ethnic disparities disappeared. This finding suggests that these disparities may be explained by these demographics. Also, there were no racial or ethnic differences in how COVID-19 stress influenced cognitive health. But what we did find is that family conflict change, that is when individuals reported that they had more family conflict during the pandemic, they also reported worse cognitive health, and this was true across race and ethnicity. So what are our conclusions? Living in a socio-historical period where Arab Americans are emerging as a distinct racial and ethnic group, we show the importance of including them in a comparative analysis because it adds to the discussion of health disparities. It's especially important for key parts of the country like the Metro Detroit area in Michigan, where Arab American populations are prevalent. But more broadly, really including this group allows us to identify both unique and universal elements when it comes to thinking about theory and suggesting practice guidelines. What we found is that Arab Americans experience more stress from COVID than whites. We also find that cognitive function measures operate differently for Arab Americans than they do for whites or Blacks. And finally, the universal finding is that more family stress is associated with worse cognitive health, really drawing our attention to social relationships as a key area for future research. Finally, I'd just like to acknowledge that this work is a team effort. I'd like to recognize my collaborators, Tony Antonucci and Laura Zahadny, as well as Simon Brower for his work on the analysis, and of course, the National Institute of Aging for supporting this work. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. We will now have time for question and answer period. If you have any questions you'd like to share with us, please do so now. Everyone, for those very interesting presentations covering a nice range of issues in the area of social relations. So we have a few questions that I will pose to you and ask you to briefly respond to. Then I'll go in the order of the presentations. Jess, could you say a few words about what do you think the permanent change might be in the use of ITCs by older people? Permanent resulting from the changes that we saw that you reported on during the pandemic.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think by and large and globally, we saw an increase in ICT use or information communication technology use across the board during the pandemic, and especially among older adults, as we saw the older adults were among the more vulnerable during the pandemic. It was of increasing importance to stay home. So with any hope, that trend will continue. However, it's important to note that these numbers of increased ICT use among older adults include older adults of higher socioeconomic status and tend to be on the younger, older side as well. So we're still holding out to connect those who are disconnected and reach as many seniors as possible, because in the same way that we got more people using technology during the pandemic, there was great risk to exacerbate the digital divide as well by making everything technological, and those who don't have access still don't have access. So we came a long ways, we still have a long ways to go.
Thank you. Also, I thought there's a lot of intergenerational communications during the pandemic because young people were often the ones explaining ITC to older people. Maybe that intergenerationality will continue. Rita, let me ask you a question. Your thoughts about immigration are really quite interesting. And I think I thought of my own family because my grandparents on one side and my great-grandparents on the other side were immigrants. And I wonder, given the immigrant experience you reported about, what do you think the generational changes will be? You say your generation, so I was thinking about my grandparents, but your generation versus your children or grandchildren's immigrant experience. How do you think that will change?
Great. Can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Oh, good. Yeah. So thank you for the question. I think, well, relating to Jess' presentation about use of ICT, I think that will play a great role and probably made the intergenerational differences. I'm thinking about just people a generation earlier, immigrants have to cost a lot of money to just make a phone call versus me, here, us all over the world and free, leveraging the internet, making connections, make us connect a lot closer. So I think that will play a role. And there's a lot more to look at when we look at social isolation, loneliness, and then maybe in relation to technology use.
Yeah, I know. I was thinking about this. There was tales in my family of the number of trips by boat that took weeks for my grandfather to come from Italy and go back. And of course, there was a whole ritual of how often you went, which wasn't very often because it was expensive, and all the gifts you had to bring, because of course that's one of the things you did. But now if you talk to everybody, twice a day because it's so cheap to do so, I think those conventions are quite different and changing for the future. Okay, Kate, thank you for your presentation. It was very interesting to hear your theoretical developments. I'm fascinated by them. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about social opportunity structure changing.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think the technology example is a really great one, and one that I brought up before. But, in terms of social opportunity as being represented by kind of the availability and costs. So the availability of social ties and costs, obviously, we see a lot more availability and decreased cost because of these technological changes, but also thinking in terms of like other current events. I mean, I think, we had already developed this theory many years ago, but suddenly in the context of COVID, it became so clear how strong of an effect our context has on our social opportunity structure. I mean, we were suddenly faced with, spending a lot of time with our close others and not so much time with anyone else for long periods of time. And so, the model can really capture these, these huge contextual changes, but also smaller contextual changes. I mean, COVID is the most obvious example, but the sort of technological advances we've seen have been changing like slightly more gradually, but also, rapidly over time. So one of the things I like about this model is that it can really capture a lot of different types of change, both sort of over onto genetic time, but most importantly over socio-historical time in sort of seeing how the macro level context is changing and how that affects both the availability of social ties and the cost of investing in those ties.
Yes, really, it's amazing how much things have changed over so fast a period of time. And I worry, but also applaud our ability to adjust as quickly as we are adjusting, and hope we can figure out how to, I don't want to use the word manipulate, but structure those changes in a way that has the most positive outcome and leads to the most positive results for the greatest number of people. So thank you, everyone. Unfortunately, our fourth speaker couldn't be with us because her daughter's getting married, and she says her house is madness. There's no quiet place in the house. But if you have any questions for her specifically, you can email her directly. or me, and I will be happy to pass them along. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for your time, presenters, and for your listening to those who are listening to us.
Thank you, Tony. Thanks for organizing. Thanks, everyone.
everybody.
Thank you.